Welcome to this podcast. I am Garth Brink, and in this podcast, I will be in discussion with Dr. Paul Wijnberg, a medical practitioner. And this podcast is brought to us through Growth Beyond Knowing, which aims to realize our own inner potential, and in so doing, that we impact on the lives of others, which will be for the mutual good and benefit of everyone. John, we have at least two things in common. Both of us obtained our medical degrees from the University of Pretoria, although there was some time difference. And I'd love to dig into your memory and share some of our experiences and maybe identify some of the great people that were there at the University of Pretoria during our time. But that obviously is for another opportunity. But the most important, and the one that I would like to focus on now, is basically our enjoyment in writing. And that really is an interesting aspect that both of us do share.
Yeah, thanks, Garth. It's really a pleasure to be on your podcast. Writing evolved, I suppose, gradually. I was spending a lot of time working on my own, doing rotational work on sites, and I went through a little bit of a tough period. And I got myself a little red book, and I started to sort of note how I was feeling. And, that was sort of a place where I could go, because I didn't have many people to talk to about things. And so I was sort of writing up my feelings, and then I started to quite enjoy it. I found it very useful. And so it sort of evolved from there.
It's interesting because writing is almost then cathartic in a sense. It is part of expressing our own inner self. It is reliving certain experiences through another medium, through which we hope to enable others to also learn through our experiences as well. And you mentioned that you went through a period when you had very little communication with others, and you have led a relatively nomadic existence, firstly in South Africa, then you worked in the United Kingdom, and travels have taken you to markedly, strikingly different countries: Tanzania, Gabon, Australia, Kazakhstan, and Canada. And you've come across very different communities, cultures, attitudes, apart from the medical aspects, of course, which there are a lot of common things, but sometimes depending on the area in which you are, your epidemiology and distribution of disease is very different depending on the country where you are. But could you highlight the one country that you found actually to be most satisfying? Well, not necessarily satisfying, but just enriching. Not necessarily setting up medical programs, but in your work with the community.
Yeah, I've been very blessed to be able to work in all these different places, but Gabon was by far my favorite place. But it didn't start off easy. I spent just under 10 years in Gabon, and actually the first year that I was there, I regretted not having taken another position somewhere else because it was really tough. I didn't speak French. And I worked in a clinic with a French surgeon running it who was pretty tough on me. He was an ex-military guy. But after sticking it out for a year and learning the language and eventually becoming very good friends with the old grumpy surgeon, I started to actually get into once you can speak the language, you start to communicate with the people, and it just became a richer and richer experience. It's real Africa as well. It's not like South Africa where we're so sophisticated. So we had to be a lot more resourceful than in South Africa. Work-wise, it was very stimulating. I mean, there was obviously a lot of malaria and other tropical diseases. And then socially, we were actually really able to mix with all sorts of people, local people. I mean, we just lived in the village, and very different South African setup. And that was nice, especially once I could speak French, because all the local people speak French, and they have so many different languages there that Everybody speaks French as a common language. And yeah, I made a lot of friends, loved it. Also an incredibly beautiful country from a nature perspective. There's a very small population, just over 1 million people in those days, and huge tropical forests. It's just an amazing place. Really, very, very lucky to have been there.
I think it's interesting that how much there is a desire to go back to a more rural existence where it's less complicated and one has the time to really marvel at the wonder of nature and to be not so bogged down by, shall I say, the high-tech environment in which many of us find ourselves. And in many of the workshops that I've been involved in masterclasses, there's always this desire for us to go back to nature and to try and reconnect with nature itself. Because after all, we basically we are, yes, maybe part of the universe, but we are part of nature itself. And we have to be able to integrate to nature and also to look after the planet in which we are currently inhabiting. And maybe one of the positive impacts of the lockdown through COVID-19, and this is all that I want to mention, is that there is far less carbon emissions that are resulting due to the lower traffic and aircraft travel that is currently taking place. But that's for another time, and certainly to explore your nomadic life. Another point which you made, which is so relevant, and in our travel medicine course, we talk about the expatriates, and the expatriate then who has to adjust to a different culture, different environment, different social structures, and so on, is the importance of learning the language. And without that, I think the ability to integrate into that and to become part of it and to experience that community and that which then enriches us is actually lost if we haven't been able to do that. And as difficult as it might be, I think it's so critically important to be able to do that. But the second area that I think I'd like to explore, and that is something that we have in common, in which we found out by accident, the two of us enjoy, and that is our love for writing. And it's interesting that many of us in the medical profession have these interesting other passions, particularly in the arts, music, writing, and also painting. And you also are an artist. So perhaps you want to, before we get into the writing aspect, just talk to us about something about the interest, how it started in terms of your painting and what it actually meant to you, and still does, I hope.
Yes, it's all this. It's this whole creativity thing. It's as doctors, we probably we take a lot of hardship on sometimes, especially those of us that are perhaps a bit more sensitive. So you do need some form of release, so exercise and whatever. But I got into this painting thing because somebody had said to me, it might have been one of my brothers, and my grandfather was a good painter. Try painting. So I just got a couple of things and started, and actually I really enjoyed it. And it was actually after I'd left Gabon, and I was really missing Gabon. And I used to paint the beach scenes. And so I suppose in my imagination, I was taking myself back there, and it was an escape. And so I wouldn't rate myself. I don't think anybody would buy any of my paintings. It's really just my own little escape. And that's what so I got my kids were painting with me as well. And there's no such thing as, as a bad painter or anything. It's an experience just to have a bit of off time and dream a bit and play with the colors and the mediums, and sometimes something good. I've done some stuff I'm pretty happy with, but other times I just paint over it, or just hope nobody looks at it.
This then just brings me back to your writing. That do you use your artistic skills to illustrate your books, which we'll come on to in a moment?
Yeah, well, when I said to my mother I'm going to write this book for her, because she was a nursery school teacher, and she had tried to write a book years ago, and they she couldn't get a publisher. So long story short, she said to me, "Yeah, you must do the illustrations for it now because you're sort of painting and all that." And I did try, but it's very difficult to do expressions on faces of your little characters, and so I wasn't satisfied with the work that I was producing. So I got somebody else to do the illustrations for me. Thankfully, makes a much better book.
So interestingly enough, and probably because of your mother's teaching experience and the like, the focus of your writing, as we discussed before, is children. And you also mentioned that you want your stories to be our medicine, which is interesting. Again, as I mentioned earlier on, that we want to share those experiences. We want to share our feelings and emotions, and perhaps allow the reader to go along the journey with us. The first book, as I understand it, that you wrote was The Old Man and the Fat Ginger Cat. Well, that's a very interesting title. There were two things that I'd like to ask is, why specifically are you drawn to children? And you mentioned partly how you got started in writing, but perhaps to detail it a bit more. And why this intriguing title about the old man and the fat ginger cat? So you've got something going to children, and you bring in the old man, and cats and children get on usually very well because it's usually one of their first pets. So somewhere there's a link, perhaps, as to that title. So perhaps you'd like to go through it.
I really enjoy kids. I mean, I've got 3 kids. If I was rich enough and whatever, I'd probably have another 20. I enjoy kids. I've always enjoyed kids. They say things as they are, and I'm probably a bit of a kid myself, and I kind of enjoy having a good laugh. And so kids are, but at the same time, they're also kind of vulnerable. So I feel I'm always very protective, especially when they're very young. And I mean, I remember when my kids were young, I was, very keen that they should be aware, for example, of pedophiles and things like that. So I educated my kids very early on that certain things were not acceptable, and this and that. To the point, it's actually quite funny. One day, my youngest son came to me. He's about 5, and he said, "Dad, I think that guy's a pedophile." And I said, "No, he was." What boy was saying it a bit loudly as well. I thought, no, maybe the guy was. But kids are fun, and I think if we can invest more in children and treat them as bigger people earlier on in life and really listen to them, I think it would help them become less complicated adults. There's so many adults that have problems, and when you dig into it, often those problems stem from childhood issues. So the kind of the way I try to write is to give the child and the person, the adult, the parent, or the whoever it is reading the book with them, an opportunity to every now and again the book stops, the story stops, and there's a bit of a question time, and we say, well, what do you think of this situation? To try and stimulate the child to think and to share their ideas, and also maybe get the adult to see that children don't always see things the same as them, and why not, and give the child confidence to have their own ideas as well. So got onto the children really because my mother was a nursery school teacher. So her book that she couldn't write was a children's book. And I mean, I thought, well, children's book would be really easy. It is kind of easy to write. It's fun. You can really stretch your imagination. The animals talk. Anything can happen in a child's story. So it's fun.
And then how did you come to the title of The Old Man and the Fat Ginger Cat?
Yeah, this is funny because actually this story there's a little bit of truth to it, because my Indonesian wife, her father got sick and tired of their cat, their street cat, who kept fighting with other cats. And one day fell through the ceiling, and that was it. So the old man, who's this chap, took this cat to the forest and dumped the cat and said, "That's it, your days are up, you're not coming back to my house and breaking the ceiling anymore, and that's it." 2 weeks later, so obviously my wife was very upset. Everybody was upset. I think the old man regretted it a bit as well, but that was that. And 2 weeks later, the cat pitched up at the house and was back. So it was great, and everybody was very happy. So that, there was, and the old man had forgiven the cat, and it was, so somehow this thing just sort of twisted itself into being my story. So there was a little bit of a true side to it.
Yeah, it really is wonderful. And I think that you're so right that the children really are, well, they're the future.
They are the future.
How much time do we invest in them? And not investing in them in the sense of making sure that they're technologically up to the speed of everything else, but it's in terms of the interpersonal relationships that we develop with the children, which are so incredibly vital. Now, I can identify with you so much in terms of the teaching aspect, because the three women in my life are all teachers in special education and remedial teachers, my wife and my two daughters. Yeah. And their interaction with children, I am astounded as to the depth of interaction. And the shift that I see currently is that they are almost becoming a parent to many of the children, because the basic essential in terms of parent-child interaction are missing. Yeah. And that is, it is distressing in a sense, and I see it to a lesser extent in the practice sometimes when I see children. But the current pandemic, which has erupted, is been quite distressing in the sense that many children have become incredibly anxious for various reasons. I don't want to go into it, but a lot of the anxiety is fed from the parents. And your latest book, which I believe deals with the current COVID-19 pandemic, currently in the press, is Wellness for All Kids. Yeah. And perhaps you could sketch some background about that book.
Yeah, that should come out sometime next year. So that's with the publishers, and that came about because quite quickly after the lockdown and all this sort of hysteria, I don't know how it came about. I just suddenly decided to write this book, and the purpose was to give kids some sort of assurance, that things firstly would be fine eventually. So it's one of these, it all ends well. And then what sort of constructive things they could do during this difficult period, be creative. So, and I talk about a heart garden and all sorts of things, positive stuff. Be kind to other people. Perhaps a positive thing might be to phone your grandmother who's on her own once a day and ask how she's doing. And the other thing I address is the sort of misinformation thing. So the father is a fireman, and so he's working very hard and stuff, and they decide to not watch the news that much anymore because the father says it's all doom and gloom. It's important to know what's going on, but we also need to be careful we don't take too much on board. So there's a little mention of that, and so they play cards and they do other things. So we go through, it's a very short story, and it's also a coloring in book. So we'll see how that goes. But actually it was quite difficult to get it. I was going to self-publish it to start, and then because it had in the introduction something mentioned the word COVID, that got kicked straight out. And but anyway, it'll be coming out next year sometime. Hopefully will be appreciated.
I think it's an interesting aspect that you mentioned in terms of the misinformation that we are subjected to, and how does one actually sift the chaff from the wheat and decide what is something that we need to take cognizance of and some which we can reject. And if I relate this to the children as well, and a lot of the anxieties that I see is basically because they are fearful for their parents as opposed to themselves so much. They're not so frightened about them getting or contracting COVID-19, but of the parents. And this then comes to this whole separation anxiety issues and so on. And the second thing, which is very, very apparent, is the difficulty that has resulted because they weren't allowed to socialize and be in contact with their peers and play their sport and go out and do the things and have the fun things, which again is a reflection in terms of, and I hope that the adults, when they see these books, when we as parents see these books, also think about whether or not we spend enough time playing. And I'm not talking about going pub crawling and that sort of playfulness, but just playing. I think as adults we've forgotten how to play. And in children, development is so important on play. And how they interact with everybody else is learned through a playing scenario. So I do hope that adults too will take time to browse the book and perhaps read it with their children to actually see what it is. I also understand that you have done other books as well. And is there a way in which we can find out more about the books and about your writing? Website, contact details, and where could we possibly find these books?
Yes, you can go to my website, which is www.balibuku.com, which means balibooks.com, and there I've got a link so you can get them on Amazon and Ingram Spark also print them. I did look; you can buy them in South Africa too, but they're quite pricey, and I'm trying to find out why. I think it might be because they imported or something. But there is a free Kindle version. I made that free, having a paper book, which I kind of like having, and you can read it again. But there you are. So people can access that. Just talking of one last point, that it's on the point of nature. I do try and constantly make children think about nature in my stories. And, for example, in the one story, it's sort of how the eagle goes to get food. And I mentioned, well, the eagle doesn't go down to the shop, they have to go and hunt for food. So just try to plant little seeds in children's brains to think about how nature works, and perhaps they can relate, start, because the children are, not only children, everyone's becoming increasingly disconnected from nature. And we need to try to put a stop to that, reconnect with nature.
I think that is so true. And I know that you had the opportunity of growing up on the farm, and that you were subjected and exposed to the whole aspect of nature. And again, speaking to my teacher family, and they would ask their children about milk and where does it come from, and they say, well, you just hop down to the store and you have milk.
That's right.
And that is something that, because of our generation, we would know certainly I knew little about farming. I didn't actually grow up on a farm, but we understood those things and we were exposed to those experiences. And I think that today, in the high-rise buildings of the urban settings, many of our children regrettably do not get that experience. And yes, I know that schools arrange outings for them to, but nature is so wonderful, and if one understands nature, one can just but marvel at it at all, and just be very grateful that we are able to share it and to enjoy it. And again, just in concluding, because as you know, we're doing a conference in Skukuza, and hopefully travel will be a lot easier. But something that struck me was this whole issue of sustainability. and leaving a legacy. And I think that perhaps we are missing the boat terribly, and in that we're not focusing enough on sustainability and actually leaving a legacy so that our children will at least be able to enjoy nature, and that we wouldn't have actually tied everything to extinction. But that's another issue, and perhaps another time for another podcast. But I'd like to very much for sharing your thoughts on some part of your life and the writing and what it means, and certainly that it will enrich children's lives. And I think through the children, because we often live through our children, well, directly and indirectly. We don't want to live to the extent that once the children leave the nest, that we are totally devastated that we can't function. But children are a delight to us, and they really provide so much fun and so much humor and enjoyment that we need to learn to be able to really appreciate them and to really nurture them to the extent where they have a wonderful understanding of the world in which we live. So John, thank you very much for your time, and wish you well with your writing, and we shall catch up again at some stage, and perhaps to talk a little bit more about some of your medical experiences as well, and the impact that it has and the changes that it has in us as humans as to how we appreciate things around us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Garth. I appreciate your time. Take care.